Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies that I can't be with you today in Palermo, but unfortunately I'm stuck on the other side of the world in Australia. However, thanks to the benefits of technology, I'm able to come to you and make this presentation. And I guess that's one of the themes of the presentation today. It's all about the impact of technology in the online world and responding to two of the offence types, I guess, that have been made new or have become modern versions of themselves with the rise of technology. So we all know that the world has embraced information technology. We know its ever-increasing use, its rapidly evolving capacities, and they've enabled the development of a whole range of new crimes or revolutions in old crimes. So my aim today is to discuss responses to two forms of online and electronically based crimes. And these are crimes that have existed for some time, but the nature of their content has changed and their incidence has increased rapidly and widely through the use of technology. Both of these crimes, the viewing and sharing of child pornography material or child exploitation material as it's now become known, CEM, and the scamming or defrauding of victims are also quite difficult for police to respond to. Further, police must take into account the impact of personal shame on both victim and offender behaviour when developing new methods of prevention and response. So these emerging responses I'm going to talk about today, they're not evidence-based responses yet, but they offer new ways to address these crimes that I think are worth considering at this conference. But first, what are the drivers of online crime? Well, the reality is it's about the increased usage by the population of online technology provides a better audience for criminals to exert themselves or to cause offences. Enhanced technology has meant that we can now communicate around the world very, very quickly, and the old-fashioned sea borders or air borders are no longer a problem in terms of victims being preyed upon by offenders from the other side of the world. The other issue with online crime is anonymity. It's very easy to remain hidden when you're trying to create offences these days in the online world. There's a reduced risk of arrest because often you're working in a country, committing crimes in a country where you don't actually live. And of course, there are also monetary awards. You actually can get benefits from committing such crimes. Let's look briefly at the issues of online fraud and exploitation and just define those before we get into the paper. Online fraud I'm defining as exploitation of vulnerable consumers for financial gain, and it includes things like romance scams, which I'll talk a bit more about, lottery scams, advanced fee fraud, business scams. There's a whole range of scams that go on, and often the offenders, as I've said, are actually located in a country different to the victims. When it comes to online child exploitation, I'm talking about the exploitation of children online through the production and dissemination of images and the pornographic images and the facilitation of child sexual assault. So we're talking about matters that cover things like viewing pornography, sharing or creating child pornography, grooming offences, and also contact offending, actually committing physical assaults on children of a sexual nature. What about the extent of the problem? Well, very briefly, to give you an idea of the nature of the problem we're dealing with, using some Australian data and also some UK data. In terms of online fraud, it's estimated that almost 10% of the Australian population has been victimised, and losses are estimated to be in excess of 1.6 billion Australian dollars, so about 1.5 billion US dollars. With consumer fraud, about 7% of the population have been victimised, with losses of about 1.4 billion Australian dollars. Romance frauds or romance scams are estimated as producing the highest financial losses for individual victims. It's been quite hard to estimate just how much victims have been providing to scammers in romance scams because these crimes are quite hidden in nature. The victims are often quite ashamed if they realise they've even been scammed. What we do know is the victims are most likely to be female, about 70% are female, and usually aged over 45 years. And often they can produce or give away sums of money in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Certainly over $20,000, $30,000 is not unheard of at all. So these are quite expensive scams. In terms of online child exploitation, there's been a rapid rise, huge rise in the increase in investigations of online child exploitation in Australia and also around the world. The conviction rate, though, has stayed relatively low. So there's a huge number of investigations going on, a huge number of cases for which materials are being stored and assessed, possible investigation, but the actual number of convictions is still fairly low, even though that is actually increasing. And it's the same picture in the United Kingdom as well. So what are some of the challenges for police? Well, firstly, again, it's about geography. Offenders are often located in overseas countries. That can make it difficult in terms of time zones, working with other police forces, language difficulties. There's barriers to sharing information between police forces sometimes or intelligence agencies. And then there's problems about getting mutual assistance or arranging extradition of an offender once the case has been proved against them to some level. As I said earlier, it's actually really easy also online to try and hide your identity to actually make it difficult for people to track who you are if you're an offender. It's also difficult to track victims as well for similar reasons, sometimes inadvertent, but yeah, it's not easy to go and find your victims or your offenders in these sorts of crimes. It's also difficult in terms of online child exploitation when you've actually identified a household where a computer is being used to view pornography, child pornography that is, to actually determine which individual in the household was the person who was actually doing that, committing those offences. Sometimes there'll be more than one person in a household, and you'll have to look through a range of individuals to actually determine who the offender was. Other issues are around the nature and size of the problem that police face. There are difficulties in tracking cases because of rapidly changing crime typologies. So criminal behaviour is changing to keep ahead of police. Police are trying to catch up, and often it can be difficult. There's like a lag, if you like, such that police are always playing catch up to try to keep up with the offending that's going on and their new ways of offending. There's a huge amount of digital material that police are now storing, which has to be assessed forensically and for use in investigations. An amount of material that's way beyond what police will ever get to. The resources will never be there to actually enable that to happen. So this huge increase in material and also in identified cases has meant that the investigation of all cases of child exploitation or fraud is impossible. So we have to find another way forward, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. So what might we do differently with, in terms of our policing responses to online fraud and online exploitation? Well, I want to talk about three aspects today. One is in terms of online fraud, a victim-focused approach, where essentially police are now locating victims and persuading them to cease further contact with offenders in order to prevent continuing victimisation. It's an early warning or early intervention approach such that when they get information or material which indicates a person is the victim of a scam, usually through financial intelligence means, they will actually go and visit that person and try and get them to desist from contributing money to this person. I'll talk a bit more about that. In terms of online child exploitation, one interesting approach which may get trialled is around as an offender-focused approach, and it's about locating offenders and persuading them to cease offending and to prevent the development of more serious illegal activity. So basically, it's an early intervention approach, taking low severity offending, low severity offenders, and actually visiting them and saying, we know what you're doing, issuing a caution, and then actually taking other actions that may actually lead to the offender reducing or stopping their offending without the need for full prosecution, which is going to be rare to get at any rate. So I'll talk a bit about that. And then finally, what these things need is to actually make them effective is effective targeting of very limited resources. So triaging or sorting, if you like, such that the police can identify victims and offenders for these sorts of interventions in an effective way, in a time-effective way, a cost-effective way, so they're actually able to go out there and maximise the benefits of intervention. So in terms of scams, I'm going to talk mainly about romance scams as one particular form of scam. Now we know that fraud activity like sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes because of the shame, the embarrassment that the victim feels. The victim may feel they asked for it, that there's a guilt attached to them being duped or being tricked by the scammer. And also there can be perceptions this isn't actually a crime, therefore I don't need to report to police and seek assistance. Now the intent with the intervention that's happening now in some jurisdictions in Australia is not to wait for a report from the victim, because often this crime is underreported, but to sort through financial transaction material or other intelligence to proactively identify people who may be a victim of a scam and then visit them, physically go and visit them at their home to warn them of the risks, that the fact that they're being scammed, the person they're sending money to isn't the person they think it is, to also provide support through victim support services, and also to follow up with the person as well to see how they're going down the track. They can also, of course, involve the victim then through in giving a statement and trying to collect more information to prosecute an offender. But again, these offenders often aren't in our country. They're overseas somewhere, and this can be hard to do. They'll also use intelligence information to focus on other transactions made by individuals or victims to known scam offenders. So again, it's collecting a pattern of information, identifying people at risk, but then physically going out there, locating those victims, disrupting the scam by basically saying, we know this person you're sending money to is a scammer, is a fraudster, and hopefully getting the funding that's being sent to that person stopped. And hopefully in an early stage where the money that has been sent isn't of a significant size or sum. And again, at the end, you still try and prosecute offenders, but in most cases that can be difficult to do. And I'll give you an example of a case that's happened in the last year or so in Western Australia and as part of our jurisdictions. And it involved a man actually who had been sending money to the United Kingdom to a woman he thought who was going to become his wife. And he'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in supporting this person to get her visa, to pay various bills and things. Now the police actually identified him fairly early on as a victim of a scam and actually went to visit him. And they said to him very clearly, the person that you're sending money to is a scammer, is a fraudster, stop sending money. He didn't believe them and he kept sending money, and in fact the police kept following up on this person and going back to revisit him and trying to stop him from engaging in this behaviour. And at the end of the day there was a newspaper story where he came into the paper and gave his side of things and said how he wished he'd stopped earlier from his being caught by this person in the UK and wished he hadn't sent as much money. Despite having 3 or 4 police warnings, this man had sent $800,000 to the United Kingdom. It just shows how hard it can be to break through a victim's sense of denial of what they're experiencing as a fraud. So 3 visits by police in uniform saying you're in trouble, you're being scammed, and this man still sent more and more money. And surprise, surprise, he now sees what he's done as quite problematic and he's shamed. He's also obviously has a fair bit of financial trouble given he spent so much money on this potential wife who wasn't a wife at all. It just goes to show how hard these sort of things can be to interdict or to intervene with. And I think the face-to-face contact though and the following the financial transactions is an important step that police are engaging in. Now, improvements in financial tracking and the developments of anti-fraud tools are making it easier to track fraud attempts and to warn victims. Technology is also improving police responses to CEM, to child pornography, and other online exploitation offences. Before we look at alternative approaches to dealing with CEM, we need to recognise the current limitations in policing systems though. There's a huge volume of material being collected from people's computers in terms of looking at their online engagement with child pornography, organised pedophile rings, and sometimes then leading on to grooming offences and contact sexual assaults on children in the real world as well. And it's been quite difficult for police to manage all that material in an effective way, to actually sort through those cases, to identify those cases that are the worst, those that they can have a chance of prosecuting successfully, and essentially dealing with, if you like, a small subset of all the material they've got. Now thankfully, just as the offenders are using technology, police are also using technology more effectively. We've now got a range of systems in place that allow police to very quickly triage or sort through huge volumes of material and to do so in a very cost-effective way and to collect information in an organised way that will assist with better prosecutions. So if you like, police are also lifting their game, they're lifting their approach, and they're getting better at dealing with the huge volume of online material that they're now receiving. They're better able to screen the material, to sort the material, and to store electronic evidence, and that's all a good thing. So again, they're doing a lot better than they were, but the reality is, even allowing for this positive change in information technology, the reality is the vast majority of child exploitation matters will never be able to be fully investigated. Police will have to select the most severe and those most likely to result in arrest and conviction. But what about the majority of matters that won't be dealt with in this way? What are we going to do with them? Just quickly before we get onto the solution, or one of the possible solutions, just a little bit about what we know about child exploitation and offenders. We did some research at the Australian Institute of Criminology this year with the Australian Federal Police, looking at 152 convicted child sexual exploitation offenders. What we found is the vast majority, 85%, really were looking at viewing or sharing child pornography, but they weren't committing grooming offences. They weren't committing, as far as it was known, they weren't committing contact offences or physical assaults on children, and a very small proportion were committing just grooming offences. We also know that the offenders were quite a large proportion were actually employed in professional jobs, 12% in executive positions. Over half had a partner or a spouse, a wife or a husband. The majority used some sort of encryption or some form of anonymity software to sort of stop themselves being identified. Obviously didn't work. We also know that the average number of images these people had was 23,000 images of child pornography, and one offender had over 500,000 images. We know that 53% were identified by a policing agency, about a quarter identified by some other online transaction. When they were actually investigated, 3/4 actually admitted the offence in some way, and 28%, just over a quarter, asked for counselling. Now, the basic point here is these are sorts of offenders who have a lot to lose, and they're also maybe more likely to be responsive to interventions where they have opportunities beyond just being arrested and convicted. They may have a degree of desperation to actually grasping any other option. And this is an important point. And we know the consequences of a conviction for sexual assault are really high. There's public shame, there's loss of relationships, personal relationships, loss of employment often or usually. Often they're registered as sex offenders, and there's a high degree of self-harm and suicide that attracts these cases. So we have an offender group that has a lot to lose. And one of the ways it's being talked about now in terms of responding to some of these matters that will never get prosecuted because of lack of evidence or lack of time might be to set up a caution system whereby, again, an early intervention approach where police go and visit some of these offenders and say, we know someone in this family is doing this stuff, we'd hope it'd be the low level of offending rather than severe offending. We know you're doing it, we'll offer you treatment and counselling, but we have you on a watch list. If we find you doing this again, you'll be given the full prosecutorial power of the law, and you'll be arrested and charged and convicted, hopefully. So the intention here is, and it's an early intervention that's offender focused, where we basically say, we're never going to get to these 20,000 or 10,000 offenders we know about. These the lower level offenders who are just looking at pornography perhaps, maybe what we can do is send them a caution, either face-to-face preferably, or through the mail saying, we know what you're doing. If you continue to do it, you will be arrested, but here's some alternatives that you may consider. Seek treatment, here are some options for referral, seek ways to get out of this behaviour, and if you keep going, we will track you down, we will find you, and you will be prosecuted. In the British Customs, they're using a similar approach called persuasive nudging. And it's about this idea of, rather than just prosecuting everyone who breaches custom law, it's about if you can educate some forms of lower level offending into desisting from offending and behaving appropriately, this may be a more cost-effective and more useful way forward than trying to go through the full prosecution, when often that will fail and is very expensive and time-consuming. There are still issues with this approach, obviously. How do you identify which person in the household was the offender? You may still get a person who loses their job, their relationships, their family, and there may also be some offenders who appreciate the warning from police that they're being watched and try to work to improve their own internet security so that they're not actually tracked down again, rather than actually trying to desist from offending. But we still think there's some potential there to actually explore this idea of, if you're never going to get to these offenders at any rate, can we at least warn them we know what you're doing, as a way of getting some to stop the offending? Now, there's quite a number of ethical and logistical challenges to this approach. Firstly, is it okay to not prosecute? The community expects that police will prosecute all criminals, particularly those committing such horrible crimes as child exploitation and also fraud. But the reality of the situation is many of these cases will never be dealt with. So is it not better to try and do something than just do nothing? Other ethical issues, access to financial intelligence is improving, but can often only be used in very prescribed ways, which may limit the ability to do some of the things I've talked about today. There can also be privacy restrictions, for example, on the use of credit card information. We know it's difficult in identifying victims and offenders for a range of reasons. We also know that the physical location of offenders is often different to where the victims are, which can make it very difficult to actually bring an offender to justice. So it's better to focus on what we can access. And it may also be very difficult to persuade those in contact with the criminal offences, the victims of frauds, of scams, and the offenders of child exploitation material to stop offending, even in the face of the material they're provided with, the information they're provided with by police. And then at the end of the day, we've also got to make sure we maintain approaches that allow for a good triaging, sorting or screening of only those matters that will, if you like, respond positively to these sorts of interventions. And that's where further research is required to actually identify which targets are best for the scams, the victims of scam, which targets are best for police for the offenders of child exploitation material. So in conclusion, there's a limit to how many of these online scam cases and online exploitation cases can be prosecuted. The reality is we're never going to prosecute them all for a whole range of reasons that I've already discussed. Transnational investigations, which in many cases these are expensive, slow and difficult, despite lots of improvement by police in working together over the last few years. So maybe that intervention and disruption of these activities is a better way of going, a less intense way of working, but may have bear more fruit, or at least have some positive outcomes when the alternative is to do nothing, or merely to keep the intelligence for future use. In my view, the cases that should be prioritised for intervention in terms of these models I've talked about would be those where there's immediate physical and financial harm to victims, so you identify those that there are more severe impacts for victims and try and work with those. You'd also look at the extent of the criminal conduct. Obviously, what you want to look at is offenders who are more likely to desist from offending, so probably those who aren't at the severe end, who really should be prosecuted, but those at the lower level end of offending. You want to look at those who are more likely to respond to behavioural change requests. In other words, those who, when they get the call from the police, whether they be victims, but particularly offenders, they will actually respond to the caution they get. They will take the treatment or counselling. They will change their behaviour and they will desist. And I think more work needs to be done there in profiling those sorts of offenders. And again, we need to be profiling to pick those cases where you're not going to get a criminal conviction or a criminal prosecution at any rate. In other words, those cases where if you don't do this, nothing else will happen. So what's some of the ways forward? Well, we can look at changing legislation to enable access to intelligence for targeted actions such as these. We're going to still have to increase our resourcing of cyber forensic capabilities to allow police to manage this huge volume of work and target those specific groups that we want to try and do these intervention approaches with. And then when we do this and we give these words of caution to the victims of scams or the offenders of child exploitation material, we need to monitor the behaviour over time. We need to monitor the scammers and see if these people, like that man I talked about, are still giving money despite being warned, and then go back and speak to them again. We need to monitor those child exploitation offenders who've been cautioned, such that if we do track them and we do find they are using online exploitation material or viewing child pornography again, that they are actually prosecuted, that there are a consequence to the actions. We're always going to have issues in addressing the changing nature of online-based crimes. The two approaches I've presented make best use of available technology to combat these crimes. They also recognise limitations of current policing approaches, and they provide some way forward to address scams and child exploitation material in situations where an arrest or a conviction is not and will not be possible. As technology and information tracking improves, it may be that such options can be dropped in favour of more traditional policing responses, that we go back to prosecuting everyone as our systems improve. Given that offenders also benefit from changes to technology and they continue to make their activity harder to trace, I'd argue that exploring innovative alternatives to traditional policing is worth consideration, even if it is an uncomfortable feeling to look at issues where fairly heinous crimes may be excused or only given a caution, such as child exploitation material. That may still be better than being hamstrung and not being able to do anything at all. To be able to at least give these cautions and say we're watching may be all we can achieve, but it may be something and it may actually help prevent the harm of young children. Thank you very much.